Now we're into part 6 of the history of God. Where we left off, the Dark Ages had just ended, and people were slowly beginning to lose faith in the church. And so we enter a new age. Yet, even as the church began losing its stranglehold on the people, its power did still continue to flourish. And thus we enter the time of Industrial Age. By this time, the people had forgotten a lot of the past. The church was still a dominant force, but no longer a dominating one. In fact, the church itself had begun to be divided up into other varying beliefs. All were offshoots of the original church with slightly differing views. During this time, science had become a new dominant force, and people had begun developing new fields of technology as a result. Because of science, people began to look at the world in entirely new ways, which opened up new fields of study, research, and innovation. Even though the church wasn't what it once was, countless people still flocked to the church. Most did so because it was their ticket to a glorious afterlife. Like the priests of older times, the new priests were offering the blessings needed to get into heaven, or so everyone believed. This is important because during this time, the small minority began to dominate the less fortunate. New fortunes were being made with industrialization. To make the most money possible, factory owners would work small children to death, paying workers next to nothing in some truly horrific working conditions. Even though the church was still a prevalent power, it was a very godless time. Workers were treated as slaves, paid tiny wages for doing dangerous work, and many rich people became very wealthy at this time because of the sacrifices of their workers. Where was God during this? At this point, the church basically became a commercial enterprise of its own. The goal was to make money and rebuild the empire that it had lost. The church didn't raise a voice to chastise the factory owners for their excesses. No, they praised them for their donations to the church coffers. Understand, most of these factory owners were good church-going folk. They made sure to go to church regularly and happily made donations, all the while continuing to abuse the workers that had no other choice but to work for them. If they didn't, then they would starve as everything cost money. In this same period, slavery was also an acceptable practice. Slaves were brought over from Africa and treated as worse than animals in many cases. The slave owners doing the same things as the factory owners, treating people very badly and being good church-going folk in the process. Sadly, this didn't change for many years. The rich became richer on the backs of slaves and the less fortunate. Both were treated in the same basic manner. The only real difference is that the workers got paid for the efforts, even if it wasn't enough to really support themselves and their families. It's important to understand that the people doing this believed it was God's will to do these things. That's how they justified it in their own lives. Of course, it wasn't God that made all this stop, it was other people. People from different parts didn't believe in slavery and went to war to stop it. A civil war, both sides firmly believing that it was God's will that they do what they do. How can God be on both sides? That's because the people used God's name as they pleased, to do as they wished. Thus, it took a civil war to try and put an end to the tyranny that was being perpetuated in God's name. Of course, in the end, the side for freedom won out and slavery was abolished. And this is important because that was also the time workers began to realize they too had other options. Many of them had come and fought in the war, believing it was right for them to do so. That act reinforced in the minds of the people that freedom was not something to be given away. It was valuable and needed to be fought for. And this is important as it marks the end of this age and opens the door to the next. Remember that, as it makes a big difference in the next age discussed. This, as was already stated, ends this age and opens the door to the next. Once the people realized that freedom was worth fighting for, they began to fight for their freedoms. Thus we enter the age of Mechanical Age. The single most notable feature about this age is that the workers began to fight for what was right. In fact, they began fighting for equality and rights under the law. Before this, they were at the mercy of the factory owners. Now they were beginning to band together and make changes. This too was a time of violence and turmoil. The people began to strike for the first time in history. They united and refused to work until they received fair pay and treatment from the factory owners. However, the factory owners didn't give in, they chose to resort to violence instead. And in the end, many were killed. Where to was God in all this? As before, on both sides. Just as had happened earlier, everyone believed they were obeying the will of God. Neither side saw themselves as anything other than good, righteous, God-fearing people. Even those that were doing the killing thought of themselves in this way. It took many years for workers to be seen as equal in the eyes of both the law and their bosses. It was at this time that the first unions began to form. Before them, there was nothing for workers to do but comply with the bosses. Now they had other options. They discovered there's strength when people work together. During this period, another war broke out, one that changed the face of the entire planet, a world war. People from a great many different nations picked sides and fought for what every side believed was their very freedom. As before, all sides believed that they had God on their side. Some had different ideas what God was, but they all believed that they were fighting for good and righteous reasons. In the end, the Allies won and defeated their enemy. As part of that victory, they devastated one small nation that was seen as a major instigator of the war, Germany. When it was all over, Germany was a broken people. They had nothing left, including their national pride. However, a few decades later, a man in Germany began to give his people new hope. He worked to give them a purpose and a new direction. At first, his efforts were small, but eventually they grew into something more. Those effects grew until he had captured the hearts and minds of the German people. However, that wasn't enough. He wanted more for his people than just pride. He wanted his people to become masters of their own destiny. To do this, he needed to find an enemy for the people to focus their aggression on. So he found people that had wealth and power that he and others didn't believe should have, the Jews. He began to proclaim that the Jews were an evil and corrupt group. Since the people had very little, they agreed with this idea. And over time, this man's power grew to the point that he took over all of Germany. That, however, wasn't enough for him. He began to seize even more power by proclaiming that the Jews were not human, that they were animals. He began to take away all that they had, money, land, power, and pride. Over time, it even became a crime to help or assist a Jew in any way. Sadly, that too wasn't enough. This man wanted even more than what he now had. So he began to amass a large army and slowly began to conquer his neighboring countries. Others saw what was happening and chose to do nothing. Feeling sorry for Germany, they allowed them to expand their territory and whatnot. As territory after territory was taken, this man grew more powerful. He began to proclaim that Aryans, blonde, blue-eyed white people, were the superior race. Even though he himself wasn't of this group, he proclaimed it was the fault of his father, and still just continued on. As this man's power grew, he became more and more unstable. He even went as far as enacting laws that made it okay for people to be tortured or killed for any slight against him, his regime, or his people. Children were even encouraged to turn in their parents, and no one was safe, especially anyone that was different. At the height of his power, this man massacred, tortured, and performed inhuman experiments on those deemed not human, Jews, blacks, and anyone who violated the laws of Germany. It got so bad that the German people actually became shocked by what their great leader was doing. At peak, this great leader had ordered the extermination of millions of Jews alone. Plus, he nearly succeeded in taking over the entire civilized world. Thankfully, the various nations realized that this was his plan and managed to unite and stop him before it was too late. Why, you might ask, does this have anything to do with God? All of it was done in the name of God, on all sides. This man, whose name was Adolf Hitler, did everything believing in the divinity and rightness of his cause, believing that everything he did was ordained by the Almighty God. this ends this part, and now we will move on to part 7. See you soon.